Hi, my name's Wen Li Lim, and I'll be a regular host on the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at FlourishDx and based right here in Singapore. My goal really through this role and working with FlourishDx is to help create a mentally healthy environment for people to flourish, and whether that be at work, in schools, and in their everyday lives. So a little bit about me. So I'm a former Malaysian from Penang. So a shout out to all my Penangites. It's the best place to be from Malaysia because I'm a massive foodie. But then my family migrated to Australia and I've grown up there since and started my career there as an accountant in a Big Four accounting firm. I have done a lot of things since then. So I would say a typical millennial, an older millennial. And so one of the things, though, all along was just my heart for impact and just wanting to be involved in things that create a positive impact. So whether that's volunteering or working with social enterprises in the region. But interestingly, something that a lot of people don't know is that if not for being an accountant, my other choice for a career was going to be a professional musician. So I definitely have a great appreciation for music and the arts. So I think I'm kind of, I don't know, psychologists call it left brain and right brain all at the same time. So it's all firing in all cylinders. So really appreciate being out here in Asia, really getting into the culture and making amazing new friends out here. And so glad to be also working with my fellow Aussies from back in Australia. So just a little bit about FlourishDx. They do run another podcast called the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. They are 58 episodes in, and this is the first one, an inaugural Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. So really focusing on the Asian region. And this is our very first episode. So it's only right to have FlourishDx's founder and psychologist as our first guest. And I'll be hosting this podcast and featuring other, amazing speakers, employers in the region. So it's really to be a platform for thought leadership conversations and practical guidance from subject matter experts, service providers, innovative tech platforms, and employers. Really, really excited to, so if you know of any amazing people out in, the mental health space to feature, please reach out. We really want to share people who are applying best practice, international best practice, and creating new best practices to address workplace mental health, where actually we all know in this region, it has not been high on the agenda for a lot of businesses at looking at mental health. So I really feel as a community in Asia, we have a shared responsibility, not just as individuals, but as employers, colleagues, and the broader community to create a mentally healthy workplaces and just, I guess, to prevent suffering and to promote human flourishing. So for this very first podcast, I couldn't have timed it. I don't think I timed it, but it couldn't have happened at a more amazing time, as this will be released on World Mental Health Day. So just a bit about World Mental Health Day. Its objective is to raise awareness on mental health issues from around the world, to mobilize efforts in support of mental health. It also provides an opportunity for all stakeholders working on mental health issues to talk about their work and what more needs to be done to make mental health care a reality for people around the world. So I'd like to introduce our first guest, Jason van Schie, the founder and psychologist at People Diagnostic, who's the owner of FlourishDx and another product, Flourishing at School. And he's also the co-host of the Psych Health and Safety podcast. And he's here to help me launch the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. So welcome, Jason.
Hey, Wen, thanks for having me.
No, thank you for being on. And I couldn't have thought of a better person. But let's start with...
Pretty sure I put my hand up for it, Wen.
He forced me to do it. He forced me.
Hey, one thing I'll pick you up on, you said earlier that you're a millennial. I'm pretty sure we're the same age. I'm pretty sure we're in the zillennial age bracket. So that micro generation.
I just call us old millennials. I just laugh at that.
Yeah, no, I think I prefer the term zillennial, distance ourselves a little bit from millennials. We were born analog, but we grew up in a digital world. It was introduced early in our lives. So
fair point. I think that actually just sounds better than an old millennial.
We're not old. We're not old, man.
Mature. I like to think about, being mature.
You can be mature.
We've had, I think we're mid-career, so you've done quite a couple of things in your life. So can you maybe share with us a bit of an overview of your career?
Yeah, no, sure. So I started by doing a master's degree in occupational psychology, and I did what most org psych graduates do and went into a role that did a lot of psychometric testing for pre-employment screening. That's where I cut my teeth, I guess, on psychometrics. Then I was able to spend about 6 years in a consultancy that enabled me to travel all around Australia and delivering training and consulting services around fatigue risk management, alcohol and drugs, fitness for duty, mental health, that sort of thing. So it was pretty varied, a lot of travel involved and a big focus on risk management. But in 2013, I officially founded People Diagnostic. And initially, it was really about doing face-to-face consulting and training again, more for a corporate well-being kind of client base, if you like. So rather than the health and safety focus, it was more, hey, how can we use things like sleep or good mental health practices to promote flourishing and keep us well, rather than, being a reactive thing that we do only once we've identified that we're ill. But in 2018, we officially became a technology company when we realized that there was a massive need globally to address the mental health issue. We managed to take on some investment, fortunately, and then hired our development team to become a technology company and start building out FlourishDx. And we're really pleased, where FlourishDx is now. We really believe it is the foremost tool, particularly looking at psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. So, really interested to chat today and to share with your listeners, I guess, some more of the basics that they need to understand when considering mental health and workplace mental health specifically.
Yeah, thank you. I think when I first met you, you said, when we think about health, we think of it in a positive way. And funnily enough, when people say health, I don't know why I think of a six pack. Maybe it's like, I don't think many people think about a six pack, but I'm like, oh, it'd be nice to have a six pack one day. But when we say the words mental health, we go to the other side. Literally, we immediately think about illness. We think about depression, anxiety. So I thought that was a really interesting thing that you brought up when we first started talking about mental health, that majority of people go into the negative side. Is that what you've found over and over again? And what are your thoughts about that as well?
Yeah, I got to say, first of all, it's probably been about 20 years since I've had a six pack. My wife probably dreams of a six pack when she thinks of the ideal Jason. It's probably been too many six packs in between, I'd say. But yeah, so with mental health, I think the best way to conceptualize this is that it is a continuum. And like our physical health, we can move up and down this continuum at various stages of our life. I mean, even over the space of, a month or a week even, you might find yourself in different areas of the mental health continuum. And that kind of ranges from mental disorder, and we talk about common mental disorders like depression and anxiety, for instance, to languishing, so not necessarily meeting the diagnostic criteria for a mental illness, but still not traveling as well as what you might like to be. Mental wellness, which is where the vast majority of the population sits. That means, if you're talking about the workplace, coming into work, they're productive, they're happy, but they don't necessarily have an optimal level of well-being. That's reserved for people who we call flourishing. So that is that optimal state where people are really happy, engaged, and satisfied in life. Now, as you mentioned, a lot of people do have these negative connotations around mental health. You ask people what they think of when they think about mental health, and it's often stress, depression, anxiety. Some groups where I've asked that question have said very early on in the piece, things like schizophrenia and psychosis, which are actually really serious forms of mental illness. But it's funny, right? Because if you use the term physical health, as you mentioned, you don't automatically think about diabetes or cardiovascular disease, do you? Like you say, you think about a six pack, or what does good physical health actually look like? So I think, we talk about destigmatizing the term mental health. And I think to a large degree, maybe the horse has already bolted. I think it's so ingrained in the majority of people's head that mental health equals mental illness that it's really hard to shake. And I guess that's why we've kind of moved, as many have now, to using the term psychological health, particularly when we're talking about what's happening in workplaces as compared to mental health, because there is this stigma associated with the term. There really shouldn't be. If you look at the World Health Organization's definition of mental health, it really is very much focused on the positive. rather than talking about, what does illness look like? But it is a fight, right? And something that we just have to continue to bring to people's attention.
Yeah, I think one of the goals of this podcast is to really highlight as well what good mental health looks like. If you want to get a six pack, you look at pictures, or you follow Instagrammers who are really fit. You don't go on the opposite end of town. I'm all about positive mental health. I mean, just a personal sharing. I mean, we've been stuck here in Singapore for the last 18 months. And when you talk about the continuum, it's so real to me, because there are kind of sometimes you just wake up and I feel like I'm languishing a bit, or I have conversations with friends and they're telling me how they're feeling. And I'm like, there's a word for this. It's called languishing. And they're like, oh, okay, I've never heard of it. And so then I think it's helpful to build the vocabulary and just understanding of it, so that we don't start freaking out that we're sick. When we're just having, an off day, things are just a little bit harder to push yourself through, or waking up, or getting in. And so for me, I think one of the things I've done is just to be spontaneous. I've put in things in my life where I'm like, oh, let's just on a whim do this. And it really picks me up. And I guess everybody has different ways of doing it. But I think understanding the continuum and even the definition of mental health to start with is really, really helpful. Yeah. So thank you for sharing about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely important to know.
So then let's go to the workplace. So over here in Asia, and right now, actually, working at home is default. So a lot of us who used to love to go to the office, you have your lunches and interaction with your colleagues and having, jokes at the water filter, all these things have been taken away. And a lot of people are struggling in terms of work and isolation and all these other things that come with perpetually working from home. So then from an employer side, apart from all the things I've said, like, why should employers be interested in mental health at work?
Yeah, well, you got to think about, what do employers want? They want, staff to be retained. They want them to be productive. They want them to be at work and present. They want good morale and a culture, right, where people want to belong. And so if we don't get that right, and people do become mentally unhealthy, or they're languishing, then it does have a detrimental effect on all of those different things. Probably the most acute thing that we're noticing around the world is, if you don't take care of mental health, you do get a lot of absenteeism. In fact, probably the most striking bit of data that came out pre-pandemic was from the UK. So every year they do their labour force survey, and that's done by the HSE, which is a regulator in the UK. And in the last reporting period, that only went a week into the pandemic. So we're talking about, into March 2020, they found that of the 38.8 million days lost due to non-fatal illness and injuries, that 46%, 17.9 million of those days, was due to work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. So it was the number one cause of days off work due to injury or illness. So massive amount, right? So almost half. In Australia, it's actually pretty similar. So we are seeing an increased amount of people who are making compensation claims for psychological injuries, as they're referred to. Safe Work Australia, which is, I guess, a body over here that tracks things like workers' compensation statistics and provides guidance on how to deal with hazards in the workplace, for instance. They actually found, in looking at the most recent workers' compensation stats that we've got, that the amount of psychological injuries is the worst year on record in the last period, over 10,000 individual claims, and that's gone up about 50% in the last 5 years. So what we're seeing is, record levels of work-related stress, depression, and anxiety, and that's pre-pandemic. So I guess, and we'll talk about it probably today as well, when that, the pandemic has put a lot of focus on mental health, and particularly the workplace and mental health. But we're at a crisis point well before the pandemic actually hit. Now we just have this additional pressure that's put on everyone in terms of their health and job security and all the rest. That is actually just going to, we're thinking the tail of the pandemic is actually going to be worse for mental health than the actual health implications of the pandemic. And they're going to be much longer lasting in terms of mental health as well. So yeah, if employers are interested in retaining staff, keeping them happy, satisfied, productive, reducing, insurance premiums, all of the rest, then there really should be a focus on how do we keep our people healthy and happy and mentally healthy in particular.
Yeah. And I think also that a lot of education, and this is why I'm really happy that we're doing this podcast. The number of times when I've met, recent meetings and I'm like, oh, I'm working for this mental health company. And a couple of my friends are managers and they were like, yeah, actually, I didn't realize one of my staff was struggling with depression and it kind of, they were not prepared for it. And so these conversations, I'm really hoping that we can also give tips and tools for people in terms of being able to manage and really support your teams. And this is why I think we're going to talk about an integrated model next. And also, I think we need to touch on the employer's obligation. So a lot of the times when it comes to these things, employers might start, or managers might start freaking out. It's like, oh, am I responsible for everything? And then the burden of thinking about this is actually a mental health issue for themselves because they can't manage it. They don't even know how to have the initial conversation. And now it's like, oh, well, actually employers are responsible. So maybe can you just flesh that out? And I know what you're going to say, which I think is so important to get across.
Yeah. So if we think about mental health being a continuum, as we mentioned from the outset, in a large enough organization, that means you're going to have employees at all different levels of that continuum, ranging from illness to languishing to wellness to flourishing. And so therefore, as an employer, you should really think about how we're going to meet people where they're at. What are the different services that we can provide to people? Now, commonly, as you say, some employers start to freak out and go, well, no, we are hiring people to perform a role. Our job as an employer, how can that be to help someone manage a mental illness? Or how do we, we're not supposed to treat mental illnesses in our organization, are we? And that's absolutely true. The only obligation an employer really has is to create a healthy environment where people don't get sick. In the same way that we think about the physical health and safety of employees, and we don't expect someone to lose an arm or to injure their back when they come into work. They should be able to leave in the same way that they came in. In the same way, we shouldn't have the design or management of work contribute to an employee becoming mentally unwell or overly stressed to the point they develop a psychological injury. So really, though, if you think about, and you alluded to this when the integrated model, what this is all about is actually intervening at different levels. So we have mitigate illness, we have prevent harm, and then we have promote the positive or promote flourishing. So what are you doing in each of those steps? And I've got to say, from what I've observed, is that the majority of organizations are typically starting at the mitigate illness. So even though a lot of employers are like, we don't want to treat mental illness, that's not our role, the most common provision or benefit provided to employees around mental health is the Employee Assistance Program. So a place, if you're not familiar with EAPs, this is basically where employees can go to get free and confidential counselling. That might be over the phone, it might be digitally, it may be in person. But it's highly reactive, right? Where, picking up at a point where an employee is already distressed and providing them with assistance at that point. And the idea is to try and make sure that an employee who is distressed doesn't get a full-blown mental disorder and require extended time off work. Other companies are doing things like mental health first aid training. That's quite a big movement that's originated in Australia, which is really like physical first aid training, where you're teaching certain staff how to respond in case of emergency. But instead of like a broken bone or, a snake bite, if you're in Australia, that would be a common use of first aid, maybe less so in Singapore.
Yeah.
But instead of responding to those things, how do we respond if someone was to, say, have a panic attack or suddenly become suicidal, for example, okay? And other companies are doing things like return to work. So in the same way as if someone was to break their leg and then return into work, we would make accommodations in the workplace to ensure that the person could come back to work as quickly as possible and weren't expected to do things that they couldn't do with a broken leg. In the same way, organizations are thinking, well, if someone's had a period of time off work due to a stress-related illness or a mental disorder, how do we enable them to return back to work as quickly as possible? Because we know that good work is actually good for mental health, but also not push them too hard that it's going to exacerbate an underlying issue. So that mitigate illness, if we think about the integrated model, is the area where probably the majority of time is spent, even though we always know that prevention is better than cure. So some companies are getting more preventative and they're actually starting on the wellness end. Unfortunately, that for a lot of companies means things like fruit bowls and yoga, which, may have some physical benefits for employees. However, it's dubious how good that is actually for people's mental health. And in fact, if they were going to do things to promote flourishing, they'd be much better off focusing on elements of positive psychology, using the PERMA model, for instance. So we know, for example, that, if we can increase people's experience of positive emotions like joy, love, awe, gratitude, hope, all of these nice things, then that's actually really great for people's mental health and can prevent mental illness and optimize people's ability to flourish. Giving people a sense of flow by leveraging strengths in the workplace, giving people a sense of meaning and purpose and values alignment, giving people positive, high quality connections in the workplace, and then giving people a sense of accomplishment and reward and recognition. All of those pillars are actually really important. And they're things that employees can try and do for themselves, but the employers can actually, and line managers can actually assist the employees with as well. But the bit that's often missing is the bit in the middle, which is the prevent harm. So first of all, I think we should start at a point where we're not hurting people or people aren't becoming unwell due to the nature of their work. And then we can look at what are we doing to promote flourishing. But often that bit's missing. And I sometimes wonder the amount of, wellness programs that are out there that encourage people to practice mindfulness, for example, or to, do yoga or go for long walks and count steps and, learn resilience and all the rest. But they're in a horrible workplace that is requiring them to work 14 hours a day. Their boss is horrible to them. There's bullying and harassment that's rife. But the person's supposed to deal with that by being more mindful. If anything, you'd think that would make the issue worse. So really, we see workplace mental health as a shared responsibility between the employer and the employee. And there's a lot that the employee can do around self-care, like they would with their physical health. But the bit where I think the ball's being dropped a lot is the employer's obligations. And that really, as we're mentioning, is the only obligation an employer has in relation to mental health. And that is to make sure that work doesn't suck and that people don't get ill because of the nature of their work.
Yeah, I think two things that I picked up I love that it's a shared responsibility. And I think what we're going through in Asia at the moment, being in, working from home and all those things, those benefits that before employers thought that they were helping the employees by giving these kind of benefits, that's all kind of gone away. You can't actually share a fruit bowl or, any of these well-being kind of things because everyone's stuck at home, working from home. So I think there might be a bit of a struggle on how do we do this better. And also, actually dealing with the underlying issues, it's hard work. And that's the thing. It's how do we address this? We know it's a problem. And so firstly, identifying exactly what it is, right? And then after that, dealing with it. I think a lot of people will say, okay, what's the lowest hanging fruit first? Let's just do that first. And so hence the benefit side of things, which I think is needed. But we can't ignore the fact that, like you said, it's a horrible workplace for people. So of course they're going to get sick. And So sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so a good way to think about this, Wen, is what we call the demand and resources model. So we know that demands things like, workload, lack of supervisor support, lack of role clarity. These are all demands on people and, require psychological resources to deal with them. And then we talk about resources or supports. What can we do, like giving people then more supportive colleagues or supervisors in the workplace, or giving them more autonomy in the workplace. These are things that can actually buffer the negative kind of pieces in the workplace. The problem is with the benefits kind of approach, we just keep adding supports and supports and supports, but we're not actually addressing the demands. And so there's only so much you can do. then need to think about, well, are there efficiencies that we could gain that would reduce people's workloads? But, we do have to address demands at some point, and that comes down to, as you say, understanding from the employee's perspective, what is it about the job that sucks or causes them undue stress? And then what can we do to improve that, rather than just this benefits or supports approach?
Yeah. Cool. I also really like when you talk about flow. So coming to the positive side, right? Can you maybe expand a little bit about what does that look like? What does flow look like?
Yeah, so flow, many of you or the listeners here would have heard of being in the zone. When you're at one with the music, you're completely entranced by what you're doing to the point that time just seems to fly. Often happens when we're doing something that we're skilled at, like, playing music. So I've just found out, Wen, I can't believe it, I didn't realize that you're a talented musician. Please don't leave us to, fulfill your music career. You can do that on the side. So music, playing sports, computer games, they're all times when you can just become completely involved in what you're doing to the point that time just seems to pass. And so what we talk about to achieve flow is, first of all, leveraging strengths. So it's no good doing something that you've never done before that requires a high level of skill, because you're just thinking about constantly every single action and it's really mechanical. You really want to do something where you don't have to think because you've just done those activities so many times before. And then you want what we call skill and challenge congruence. So you want to do something where the challenge is at the right level for your skill. You don't want it to be too easy for your skill level, because that just is a recipe for boredom. You don't want it to be too difficult, otherwise that can lead to stress and anxiety. It needs to be that Goldilocks point where it's just right, and then you're more likely to enter into flow. Flow is often Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's the main researcher behind the concept of flow. He talks about it being, the optimal state of well-being. So it's something that, employers can really get a lot from. If you're trying to, build engagement in employees, which I know is an outcome that a lot of HR practitioners try and drive, then the first step is to take a strengths-based approach, find out what people are naturally good at and talented at, and then find them more opportunities to do those things, versus the traditional approach to HR, which is often a deficiency-based model, which is where are people not doing well, and let's try and train them to a satisfactory level. But by doing that, you only get satisfactory level of performance and engagement. Whereas if you take a strengths-based approach, that's where we know we can get high levels of engagement and productivity.
Yeah. Wow. Just in the last kind of 5 minutes, there's just so much in there. I wish I had a pen and paper and to jot all this down, but it's recorded. So we can always replay it.
You can listen back. That's the beauty of podcasts.
So I think especially, I've just read an article recently as well on retention being an issue, especially where all the great stuff, that people may have enjoyed about going to work is kind of shelved away, and it's not there. People are actually changing jobs more often than ever. So when you talked about HR just wanting engagement, it's not even engagement, it's actually retention that is a really, really big issue at the moment. Especially in Asia. That article, I think someone they interviewed had changed jobs maybe 2 or 3 times since the pandemic started. Yeah,
what are they calling it at the moment? The great employee. It's gonna bug me now.
Yeah, the great employee. Oh, I can't. Yeah. I know we discussed and we both read the same article. When it comes back, we'll come back to it. But maybe I think the next point to really talk about is really best standards. We just talked about flow and how when someone gets into that, I can just imagine the output in terms of just the quality of work and potentially even speed of work, right? Like you're just in the zone. So in terms of best standard, there was an ISO that came out in June this year. So we're going to discuss this in the next couple minutes. So it's ISO 45003/2021 on psychological health and safety at work. And this is an international standard. And it's the first global standard on workplace mental health. I think this is groundbreaking because it's never been anything like this before. And so I know you've got a lot of resources even around this. So can you tell us about this standard and maybe why employers in Asia might actually find this valuable?
Yeah, so for the listeners who aren't aware, the International Organization of Standardization, you would think it would be abbreviated to IOS, but it's actually ISO. comes up with best practice standards with international application. So many listeners might be aware of the quality management standard, for example, 9001, the information security management standard, which is 27001. But 45003 is one of the latest. It was published on June 8th this year. And it is a child standard to ISO 45001, which is the international standard for occupational health and safety management systems. But this is, as you alluded to, the first time we've had an internationally agreed best practice approach to how we should do workplace mental health. And you know what? Doesn't mention fruit bowls or yoga at all. What it does really focus on is a risk management approach. So similar to how we deal with physical hazards in the workplace, what we need to do is to identify hazards, psychological ones. So they might be things like workload or lack of role clarity or lack of autonomy. Basically, a psychological hazard or a psychosocial hazard, as they're often referred to as, is anything about work, how it's designed or managed that contributes to ongoing or high levels of work-related stress. And so what we need to do is to be able to identify those. We then need to assess the risk, so the likelihood and consequence that harm will occur to a group of people based on the exposure to the hazard. We then need to control the risk. So what are we going to do to reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practicable? And then how are we going to monitor that over time? And then how are we going to continuously improve? So it's really great that it's not just a program, or it's not just something that you do once and then you become a mentally healthy workplace. It's not the solution in itself. It is a consultation method and a continuous improvement approach to addressing workplace mental health over time. So the idea is that you continue to go through iterations using this management system approach in order to, gradually improve the working conditions. So, and I guess, again, that's probably a big thing about this standard is it's focused on improving work, not the worker. So whereas the popular approaches to workplace mental health are very much about the individual and symptoms, so how do we make people more resilient, or how do we get them to identify when they're not doing well and get support? This is really about how do we actually understand when work isn't going well and might be harmful to people's mental health, and how do we make that better? But I guess very deliberately, it is a child standard of 45001, which is for occupational health and safety management systems, which actually is saying that workplace mental health needs to have some input from health and safety. So whereas traditionally it's always been a HR function or a benefits function, and that's fine when we're talking about access to EAP and we're doing lunch and learns and we're doing wellness activities. However, if we're talking about risk management, then it makes perfect sense to bring in risk professionals and health and safety professionals to help with that element in understanding the risk and then working with HR and OD to actually improve the risks over time. So yeah, really exciting to finally have an international standard. And I guess for employers in Asia, why this is important is that it is an international standard. It's not an Australian standard or a UK or a Canadian standard. It is an international standard. And particularly given the density of MNCs with offices in Singapore, for example, many of them will have occupational health and safety management systems that at least align to 45001. So they should be particularly interested in what 45003 may do and how they can align that with their safety management system.
Yeah. And can I ask why you singled out Australia, UK, and Canada in particular?
Yeah, I saw you smile when I had the benefit of doing this over Zoom. So really, if you think about maturity in relation to the approach that is made popular, I guess, by ISO, UK, Canada, Australia, not in necessarily that order, are probably the ones who have adopted this approach the most. Up until recently, I would say that Canada was probably leading the world in that they actually had a Canadian national standard on psychological health and safety at work, which did ISO 45003 in the development did draw heavily upon in developing this. Australia, though, I think may have just leapfrogged Canada recently because from a regulations perspective, we are actually getting more legal input into this. So whereas the ISO standard is a best practice standard, in Australia, legislation is moving to the point where psychological health and safety is going to be included more heavily in workplace health and safety legislation. So We have codes of practice coming out from the regulators in the various states around Australia at the moment to support the upcoming changes and helping employers understand what they need to do to meet their obligations. And these are going to be enforced by regulators. Whereas in many other markets, it's going to be something that is, just best practice. In Australia, it will be a legal responsibility for employers to follow. So the reason I talk about Canada and UK and Australia is that, probably the three countries have been probably tussling for who's doing this the best. Canada, up until recently, I think probably was, but I think you're going to see Australia with the legal impetus behind it probably, go ahead quite a bit in this area.
So then kind of going back to the MNCs that you mentioned, a lot of kind of APAC offices sit in Singapore. So if you're listening and you're from, an APAC and a role that looks after this region, I guess with the upcoming change in legislation, this will really be of interest to, Singapore-based MNCs.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'd love to have coffees with all of these people who are interested in finding out more in Singapore, right, Wen? You love having coffees.
I do. I do acknowledge that it's a slight addiction, but I like to think that it's a healthy one. But no, when I came to Singapore probably like 10, 15 years ago, the coffee scene here was dismal. I do enjoy the local coffee, which is, we call it kopi. And my go-to is kopi si susu thai, which means coffee with evaporated milk with less sugar. So that's my local order. Okay. But then the kind of scene for kind of flat whites and Australian style coffee really, really came up. And I would actually say that it rivals Australian coffee. So anyway, I am a lover of coffee meetings. Always happy to go out for coffee for anyone who's really interested in this.
And you know all the best spots too, don't you, Wen?
That is true. I'm quite fussy. So if I'm going to have a coffee, it's got to be a good one. Anyway. So FlourishDx, let's talk about that. So what is it and what are you hoping to achieve with this?
Yeah. So back in 2018, I guess, when we were looking at how do we address the global need for better workplace mental health approaches, that went beyond kind of the wellness approach and the EAP approach, we were really... it was really remarkable looking at the trend in relation to, lost time off work due to work-related stress, depression, anxiety, the rising frequency of psychological injuries and the cost as well. So in Australia, for instance, the average amount of time off work, if someone was to suffer a psychological injury, is almost half a year. And so no surprise with how complex and how long people spend off work, they're worth about 4 times, or they're about 4 times the cost of a physical injury claim when people are to have one. And about 9% of all of our serious injury claims now are actually mental health related. So, we saw that trend emerging back in 2018. And that's, I guess, how we were able to convince investors that, the current approach to workplace mental health just wasn't enough. Just having EAP in place to pick people up when they fall, or, just doing kind of the normal wellness stuff and resilience stuff on its own wasn't enough. There really needed to be more of this rigor around work design and what are we doing to assess and understand risk and to put in risk mitigation strategies. And so FlourishDx, really, if you think about that integrated model that I mentioned earlier on, it really is in the prevention space, and it combines risk management. So how do we assess risk? How do we prioritize based on risk? How do we monitor risks over time with a wellness approach? And really, I guess FlourishDx is unique based on the breadth of what we offer. So whereas, there are hundreds, if not thousands these days of workplace mental health apps around that really have kind of a wellness focus. And so they might be content libraries with, self-care activities, mindfulness meditations, like sleep stories, are common. Others that teach people skills around resilience or how to have a conversation with someone if you're concerned. There's so many of those around, but what we find is that we're rather unique in helping companies to really understand risks, and that's focused on the design of work. So how do we understand the risks, I guess, that the employer can control, and how can they improve the design of work over time to reduce the likelihood that someone's going to have an adverse stress reaction? But then we have a learning management system built in as well. to help to educate people around mental health awareness, because we feel that, improving literacy is very important and reducing stigma if we're going to be able to address workplace mental health satisfactorily. But then we have a wellness app as well, because a lot of, people still want a wellness app to give to people as a benefit, if you like, that have things like chatbots and guided meditations and access to, learning activities and self-care tools and that sort of thing. So really the unique proposition with FlourishDx is I guess it's a health and safety tool first, you would say, but it encompasses everything else that I guess you would expect in a workplace mental health platform, with those three kind of spheres covered. But yeah, it's an exciting time to be working in the area, particularly now with the release of the ISO standard. We're having a lot of inquiries around how we can assist companies to adopt that standard, given that's one of the goals of FlourishDx, to make it the easiest and most cost-effective way for companies to adopt the standard if they wish to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's 3 months in from the release of the standards. And I've spoken to a couple of people and they're like, oh, I wasn't aware of it. So I'm really glad that, sometimes having an awareness is great, but then it's like, what's next? And so the fact that there is a tool like FlourishDx is really, really helpful, because otherwise it's like, okay, we know this, but it's just really, really hard. And how do we do it? So I guess this is the how, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And the problem is with a lot of the mental health apps out there, the vast majority of them, probably 99% of them, would actually not help a company tick a single box for ISO 45003 adoption. They're very much focused on the individuals and symptoms and a wellness type approach primarily. They're not around helping companies to understand the working conditions and risk assessing that and continuously improving. So again, if you think about ISO being more around fixing the work rather than the worker, FlourishDx is actually really unique in that space. And so it's exciting to be out front, I feel, at the moment, and also using these channels that we have. So the Psych Health and Safety podcast, and now your great podcast, Wen, to be able to promote the idea that workplace mental health is much more than just fruit bowls and yoga.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because of the continuum that we were talking about before, the mental health continuum, I mean, there is a need for EAPs and all of that as well. And I guess one of the things, and, not even every company in Asia, will have an EAP. So there is definitely a need for, those kind of solutions. But I guess the more that you deal with it upstream and, at the source, then will stop people, because, we've spoken about this, that, once someone does get sick, the time and the cost to that, relationally. So I'm not even just talking about money. I'm talking about, just the repair and the rest, and to get someone back to being mentally healthy. That journey is a really long, and painful one. And so if we can actually deal with it at source and from an impact angle, I mean, now I'm speaking from a, chief impact officer hat. When we look at anything in the impact space and really tackling a problem, if we can get down to the root causes and really the systemic causes, that is so much better than having to do the repair work. And I guess therapy or doing the prevention stuff, it's always, people don't think about that until something happens. So I mean, this is a bit of a side story, but I think it's a really interesting one. So one of my friends, he was born blind, so he's visually impaired. And when Teslas and electric cars came out in America, they basically, the Blind Association was lobbying and just saying that, we need kind of a signal, or we need to be able to hear the car. If you have heard a Tesla or any of these electric cars, you can't hear it at all. And so if you're visually impaired, you're not going to be able to hear it. And it's so dangerous. So anyway, what happened, the story goes that there was actually a decision maker in government who he was unpacking his trolley from shopping. He's putting all his groceries in the boot, and he stepped backwards and he nearly literally got wiped out by one of these electric cars. And until he had that encounter, he then went, okay, we have to do something about this to protect people who are visually impaired. And likewise, I think the same kind of analogy can apply to mental health, is until, we only think about the prevention stuff if someone near us or we have experienced it. But sometimes, that's just unnecessary pain and cost to society and to relationships and families that we could have avoided. So I'm really, really like excited to be on board with a company that is really dealing, with this systemic, but the cause of it to prevent, and, we spoke about this earlier, to prevent suffering from people.
Yeah, the impact thing is massive, right? I mean, when you think about mental illness, it's not just the individual that's affected. It's their families, it's their friends. There's a real drain on that. Obviously, the workplace that the person's affected, their ability to contribute to the community, and get that meaning and purpose, and giving back is impacted. So the impact is not just the individual impact and, days lost, or, if you think about the disability adjusted life years, for example, it's not just that, it's then everyone else that is impacted on as well. And the reason that workplace mental health really appeals to me, and we obviously work in schools as well, is that if we can focus on the things that are known to have the biggest impact. So if you look at mental health research, intervening at the individual level in terms of impact and scale of impact is actually not as good as intervening at the systems level. So how do we, create better work to protect people, or how do we create better schooling and address, those types of environments? So if we can fix the environment, we'll actually have a much better impact at scale for mental health, and then obviously have this benefit not just for individuals but for communities and workplaces and schools as well. It's really interesting, and we're thrilled obviously to have you on board, Wen, and to have your impact hat on, because it's an area that is of massive need to have impact in.
Yeah. And you just talked about, no, sorry, I should say thank you. It's a privilege to be on board. Sorry, I'm already thinking about the next question. So you've spoken a couple of times about the schools product, and we haven't touched on it. So just very, very briefly, I'm going to give you 2-minute elevator pitch. What is Flourishing at School?
Yeah, so Flourishing at School really originated because there was a local school who were doing wellbeing according to a particular model aligned to positive psychology known as PERMA, and they had no way of measuring whether their wellbeing impacts were actually being effective. So obviously, when we talk about impact, we like to be able to measure impact, and this school had no idea if they were having that measurable impact. And so they asked if we could develop a tool for them to measure, which is where the Student Flourishing Survey was born. And really the goal of Flourishing at School now is to be a primary prevention approach for schools. So rather than being an approach which helps to identify kids who are at risk, even though it can do that through some of the tools that it now has in it, the primary purpose of Flourishing at School is to help kids and schools work out how students are developing the pillars of good mental health known to prevent illness and help them to flourish. And then either do that intervention at a group level or at an individual level. So we talk about it being very much a pastoral care tool now, in that, it really does facilitate great discussions between teachers or pastoral care team members and students on how a student might be able to remain mentally healthy and optimize their wellbeing.
And are we allowed to say what school it is? Because it is the high school that I went to, and I'm so proud that it was them.
Yeah. So the very first school that we worked with, Rossbourne Senior High School, back in 2014. So
shout out to Rossbourne High School. And you know what, when I think about high school, and actually here's the story. The reason why I became an accountant was actually I had the best accounting teacher, and just the best teacher ever. And it's amazing how many of her students that did accounting in year 11 and 12 became accountants because of her. So, I mean, just the impact that teachers have, and teachers is one of the things that, there was an article that came out in Singapore just about on Teachers' Day, how teachers were saying, and who were being interviewed, saying that their mental health is the lowest it's ever been. And so, I don't think you touched on this, but the Flourishing at School platform also includes teachers. Can you expand a bit?
Yeah, so we found out very quickly when we started working with schools, because when we validated the Flourishing at School survey, we managed to recruit 15 secondary schools around Australia participate in the validation, and they were all very interested then in continuing to use the measurement tool. And we found that there was a lot of schools who are very interested in measuring wellbeing for students and doing a lot of wellbeing initiatives for students, but the teachers would get left out. And we found that the schools that weren't including teachers in the conversation actually, they weren't having positive wellbeing results for students. And no surprise, right? If teachers are completely out of the loop, we talked about the importance of literacy before, right? Being able to actually understand just basic stuff around the mental health continuum and, things like PERMA. If teachers are out of the loop in relation to that, if they're already overworked and burnt out because of the, massive workloads that teachers usually have to maintain, if you throw wellbeing at them without giving them the time and the resources to be able to do that, there's no way that it's going to work. So we actually made a deliberate decision a few years ago that we wouldn't work with any new schools unless they also included teachers in it. And so now, yes, Flourishing at School and FlourishDx is actually on the same software platform, and they're completely integrated so that when teachers have a FlourishDx account, they can, if they've been given the permissions, be able to see the data for their particular students and then be able to have data-informed wellbeing discussions with their students. And we're really excited about future features that will help with kind of the, not just understanding wellbeing and measuring wellbeing, but also then how do we improve wellbeing? So what are the interactions that teachers and students can have through our platform that might help to encourage things like, developing character strengths, for example, or, giving kids reward and recognition and that sort of thing as well, which we know is also positive for wellbeing.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, yeah, it's such a big need out in schools. So I'm really glad that there is a product for high school students. So this is for secondary school students.
Yeah, specifically focused. I mean, there are some modules within Flourishing at School that are available for students as young as, 9 years old, but it is primarily focused at a secondary school audience. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about two of the products already, but under Flourishing, under the FlourishDx banner, there's a couple of other things and free resources, actually. I think one of the things we want to do is empower and to help bring people on the journey. So it's really about sharing what we know, and this is why we do the podcast, but also other platforms that we have that's completely free. So can you just touch on the two first, being the Workplace Mental Health Audit and the 45,003 Training Academy?
Yeah. So early on in the piece, when we started talking to companies about what they're doing around workplace mental health, we found that a lot of them would talk about all the activities that they're doing and the resources and benefits they're providing for employee self-care. But there was a lot missing if you think about the integrated model and then a holistic strategy kind of meeting employees where they're at. And so to assist companies to evaluate where they were in terms of the employee mental health provisions, we came up with the Workplace Mental Health Audit tool. So that's available for free at mentalhealthaudit.com. And it's just 14 yes or no questions. Do you have this in place or not? And then at the end of it, you get a report which shows you what are the critical things that are either related to legal responsibilities or the ISO standard, or employer of choice kind of provisions, your desirable provisions as well. And if you click on any of those, it'll actually point you in the direction of free or affordable resources in order to address the gaps that you've identified. So it's basically a gap analysis, if you like, in your employee mental health provisions. The second tool, which we're really excited about, was the 45,003 Training Academy. So on the day that this standard was released, we released our foundations training course on the 45,003 standard. Like you said, it's completely free. Mainly video content. I am the facilitator of that. However, I got to give a shout out to Joelle Mitchell, the org psych on our team, who is actually our ISO 45003 expert, who actually wrote the content for that training and did an amazing job. So that's available for free as well to help people to understand the standard and how it might fit into a safety management system. But now we're also releasing other training courses for free through the 45,003 Academy, which is at www.45003.org. Okay. The latest one is on how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment, and it does talk about some of the FlourishDx tools that can help companies to do this at scale. But then, we're going to be adding additional training courses hopefully fairly regularly to that, so that companies can start to really build their competence in what they can do to create mentally healthy workplaces.
And I think we need to have Joel on the podcast. I think
I'm sure you'll have to have her on at some stage. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to talk through it. And I think sometimes when the standard numbers and all, it just seems really intimidating. But then I think having her on there and we can just break it down into like bite-sized chunks as well, I think that will just give people a lot more comfort and, like a lower barrier of entry as such to start on this journey.
Yeah, Joelle will be an amazing guest for you to get, Wen. Hopefully you can get her. She is in demand.
Okay, I'll put my name on the waiting list. And so then we spoke about this before, but the Psych, Health and Safety podcast, which is 58 episodes in. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Number one, who are the listeners and really what's been the impact of it as well? But secondly, there are 58 episodes and no one is going to have a lot of time. Well, you know what? Actually, you should give a prize to someone who literally listens to every single episode. But if people were to choose 2 or 3 episodes, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so interesting you said that because I just saw on LinkedIn, I think today someone mentioned they've listened to every single episode. So we're talking about 60 hours worth of audio.
Claps to them, man. That is amazing. 60 hours.
Yeah. So I'm really surprised that you didn't listen to the whole back catalogue before you joined us.
I strategically picked the ones that you told me to listen to.
Yeah, so look, we have a really wide variety of guests. So we feature either academics or practitioners or, people who have worked on the ISO standard, for example. More recently, we're starting to get more and more internal people who are doing it internally in a psych, health and safety capacity, which is really exciting. The main listeners tend to be people from the health and safety profession. I guess the name psych, health and safety kind of, draws people from that crowd. But also HR and people and culture professionals, listen to it as well. And then a lot of people just working in the workplace mental health space who are just trying to improve their own game and how they can support their clients in this area. In terms of my favorite episodes, or the best ones to listen to, one of the more recent ones, episode 55, is with Professor Tony LaMontagne. He is the man behind the integrated model of workplace mental health. And I think we tried from episode 1, if you listen to our back catalogue, we mentioned him quite a number of times and how we're trying to get him on the show. We finally got him on the show thanks to a previous guest, Angela Martin, who's also amazing. Listen to her episode. We finally got him on and he did not disappoint. The longest episode, but definitely really good at unpacking this whole integrated model and really our approach as well, which is based on his model. Actually, a very recent one because we do crossover episodes, and this will be published as a Psych, Health and Safety podcast episode as well for our listeners. And I did one recently with Brian Crook from Ireland from the Workwell podcast. And really, I was able to answer a lot of questions about the ISO 45003 standard and what that means, particularly for his audience, which is largely HR practitioners. So that's probably a nice, easy one. It was less than 40 minutes, so it's probably a good beginner one. But the Tony one definitely is one of Joelle and my favorites, and it's going to be hard to top.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, I mean, hats off to the person who listened to all 60. I actually was thinking about how am I going to listen to all 60? And I thought maybe one a day. I mean, that's always the easiest thing to break it down. And I was like, maybe I'll just do one a day.
Well, you work from home, right? I mean, I'm in the car so much. You know what it's like in Perth. You have to drive everywhere. So there's plenty of time to listen to podcasts when you're driving around. But
yeah. Well, I mean, when the pandemic first happened, I had a goal of doing 10,000 steps a day. So I could have listened to it back then. But my steps have dramatically dropped, which is something I really need to get up again. Literally, the distance I do is between my study and the kitchen. So it's pretty bad at the moment.
Well, shout out to someone else you're going to have on the podcast earlier, Wendy Chua, who in 2 weeks of hotel quarantine, she managed to close her rings on her Apple Watch every day in hotel quarantine. So
okay,
go figure.
So I have no excuse. Wow, that's it. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to having Wendy on here. She's one of the partners at FlourishDx, and she's been working in the mental health space for a long time, working with universities, workplaces, and all that. So the episode with her will be coming up soon. So I'm thinking 2 more questions. Firstly, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I think about outcomes, I really hope for a reduction in the prevalence of psychological injuries and, people having to take time out of work because of mental health issues. So that's really the goal. I mean, at the moment, it's just a trend. Every year on year, it seems like it's getting worse. So it would be great to stabilize that first of all, and then actually start to see a downward trend. That would be great. To achieve that, I think companies need to mature their approach from just a wellness only or resilience approach and focusing on individuals and making them stronger, to thinking about what can we do to make workplaces better and better supportive of mental health. It's not that we ditch all the other stuff that we've previously been doing, but I think if we do the next bit, which is how do we make workplaces better, then I think will be a more holistic strategy that is going to have a better impact and actually lead to those outcomes that we want.
Yeah, great. When you were talking, I was thinking about in the impact space is that actually all of us want to work ourselves out of a job. I know it sounds really, really random and, it sounds self-sabotaging in a way, but it's true. It's that the problems that we seek to address, the day that actually it goes away, it's a great day for everyone. So whether it's a reduction to a nil, hopefully one day suicide rate, if possible, or, like a reduction in mental illness that's caused by stressful and burnt out work conditions, like that will be an amazing day. So that's a really, really great goal in terms of the future of mental health at the workplace. And so how about people in Asia? So we've talked, there's so much content, like even I'm like, whoa, that's like, I really need to like re-listen and write it all down, but there is show notes just to let you know. A lot of the resources that we mentioned, it will be listed on the bottom, so don't worry about missing out on that. But for the first time listeners, right, this is like brand new content to them and they're like, yeah, I want to do something. Where do they start and how do you recommend they start?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that knowledge is power, and you really need to educate yourself. So definitely be listening to Wen's podcast. Wen and I did talk about the need for an Asian specific podcast, just given we're talking about before that UK, Canada, Australia is actually ahead of the curve and more mature and really probably going to be the first adopters of more of a psych health and safety approach. But we need to maybe start at a lower level when it comes to the Asian market. So things like destigmatizing mental health, just understanding that mental health is a continuum, basic mental health literacy, I think is going to be really important. But at the same time, we shouldn't be forgetting about, what is best practice. And we shouldn't just be doing all the popular stuff that has been done in all the other countries just because they're well marketed and look glossy. We should look to best practice and what does research suggest. And that's very much around, well, we can do that, but we really need to think about work design as well. So education is really king. So definitely listen to Wen's podcast. Our ISO 45003 Training Academy. Like I said, we've got some things on there already, and we'll periodically add additional content there as well, which is free and really accessible too. So I would start with that. And then, hopefully Wen starts to build her coffee community and, start to, engage with people who want to make an impact in this area as well. So definitely, reach out to Wen if you want to be part of that community. And hopefully we can get some amazing practitioners together, like the likes of Wendy, for example, and Annie, who you're going to have on shortly as well, hopefully, or like, really, people who are seeking to make an impact in this area, specifically in the Asian region.
Yeah, great. And the other thing, I mean, what I love about Singapore and Perth, it was like, we're on the same time zone. So it actually makes it super easy. Yeah. It makes it super easy when we can jump on calls together. And even, we've had a couple of clients or people who we've been talking to just dialing in to talk to Jason as well. It's been really easy to organize. So next steps, I guess, is just don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. So wherever you listen to, we're listed on all the usual platforms, and and we also have a podcast LinkedIn page as well. So you can stay up to date on when the next one's coming up and the guests that are that will be featured as well. You can follow FlourishDx on LinkedIn. We have short clips, which will be from this and the Psych Health and Safety podcast. And if you want to watch the full video, of course, which, it could be quite entertaining if you want to see our facial expressions.
You can see Wen between two ferns.
Now I've got 2 plants. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm all about it. So I used to do interior design as well. So that's something else I've done, and that's more of a hobby. So yeah, setting up and placing things properly is like big, high on my list. Anyway.
So where can they find the video, Wen?
Yeah. It's on YouTube, the FlourishDx YouTube page. And of course, let's connect on LinkedIn. I think I was actually thinking about doing little kind of tips on an ongoing basis just to build up the literacy and just conversations around mental health in the workplace. So it's kind of like something I just learned, and then I'll share it because I'm also on a learning journey. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, and actually I love being in this seat because I can ask questions and I get to talk to really, really amazing people and just absorb and listen and just learn. I think we're all learners on this journey. And actually, I think one of your podcasts was saying that, we're all not going to be psychologists or professionals in this area. And how do we bridge that gap so that that knowledge and just and the application of it is actually more far-reaching and that everyone can participate, rather than this gap of, the people in the know are the people in the know, and then we kind of just walk around a little bit blindly. So I think for me, it's always been about how do we reach a wider audience and get more people to participate and feel confident in being able to have conversations and even just ask, do get in touch if there's a specific topic or area, even out of all the content that was in here today. What are the areas that you guys want to learn more about? Because I would love to hear that so that we can, invite someone amazing. I mean, I know in the region, I've been reading about Thailand, the state of mental health there is actually really bad. And it's really, really sad. A land of smiles, but yet, there's a lot of suffering that's happening. And so when we say Asia, I know we're talking a lot about Singapore today, but we really want to just see how we can amplify and really talk, just to help in the area of mental health throughout the region. So hoping to have more coffees. Of course, if you're not in Singapore, I can't have a coffee with you, but we can have a virtual coffee. I think we've all gotten used to Zoom and just doing meetings virtually. I've met so many people in the last 18 months living in Singapore, and I've barely met, maybe less than half I've actually met in person. So it's definitely a new world that we operate in now. So anyway, thank you for your time and joining us on the first and our inaugural podcast. I'm really, really excited and happy to unpack a lot more content, talk to more people, and we'll definitely have Jason back because I think he did a really good job.
Oh, thanks, Wen.
No, every time I listen, because I sit in a lot of meetings, I'm just like, oh man, I'm just learning so much. And it's and I'm just really excited to just be a participant and just part of it. So thank you for this privilege, Jason. And I'm looking to featuring our other team members out from the Perth office and in Melbourne as well. Cool. Well, thank you. And we'll see you at the next episode. Take care.